Tremendous. Thanks so much, Shane. It's really exciting to have all of you joining us here today for this good discussion around assessing student learning amidst standardized testing changes. And there are a lot of changes that are taking place across the country. I'm really excited to have two esteemed colleagues with me who are going to be able to provide a lot of insights on what they're seeing in the field. First of all, Dr. Angela Quick is Vice President of Education and Workforce Development at RTI International, where her research foci are science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM school design, also coursework articulation and recruitment of underrepresented populations in STEM programming. Prior to joining RTI, Angela served as Deputy of Instruction for the Superintendent of North Carolina's Department of Public Instruction. She led the state-level projects that involved the design and creation of curriculum and instruction methodologies, comprehensive assessment systems, and accountability models for schools. Joining Dr. Quick is Dr. Melody Shop. She is the Director of Education Industry Consulting at SAS Institute, where she leads the education industry consulting team, which provides technical assistance to both state education agencies and local education agencies across the country in their measurement of student growth using a myriad of assessments. Prior to being at the SAS Institute, Dr. Shop spent 24 years as a classroom teacher, and prior to entering the South Dakota Department of Education, she held numerous opportunities for almost a decade with her appointment as Secretary of Education by the Governor of South Dakota, in a role that she held from 2010 to 2017. I'm really excited to hear from both of these esteemed colleagues on some very important issues that are going to be taking place and what their assessment is on what's going to be changing in some of the states and local districts. So first off, I'd like to ask the first question to you, Melody. Learning loss is on the mind of so many education policymakers across our country, both at the state level and at the local level. Assessments are one measure to see where this learning loss has occurred and begin to think about how we can best intervene for each individual student. Given the limited time constraints in this pandemic and the reality that not all schools are providing in-school learning, how should we use assessments this year?
Well, it's great to be with both of you, Angela and Jeremy, today. I was thinking this morning, learning loss and assessment. It's hard to think of two more relevant topics right now in education. Two things have happened almost simultaneously. We just signed, there was just signed the American Rescue Plan that allocated more than $20 billion for states and school districts to implement evidence-based strategies to specifically address learning loss. But if we're going to address learning loss, we need to have some way to measure it. And thus this conversation today surrounding assessments, the flexibility that's been granted by the Department of Education is just extremely timely. I think one thing we can all agree on is everyone is wanting a better understanding of the impact of the pandemic. And there's two things we know that require having appropriate assessment data. That first thing is we want to know where are students in their learning trajectory. If you're a parent, you want to know, how did my child do on the assessment? I want to know where they're at. And sometimes we refer to that as their proficiency score. But the bigger conversation, the one that we're having today, is really just how much learning did or did not occur over this past year as a result of that pandemic. There was a recent survey that was conducted by the National PTA and the Learning Heroes, and 62% of parents believe that their child is behind where they would have been in a normal school year. Bottom line, we just don't know for sure yet. And with all that speculation that's out there, the good thing to know, it is possible to reliably measure growth in any state that proceeds with their assessment this spring. And even with no assessment data from last spring, because we know the schools were closed down. So measuring that student growth using a skip year growth model allows us to see how much progress did students have over the last 2 years. And it really will help us to understand the different impacts of the pandemic on different groups of kids, which is what we want to know. I really believe that educators are so hungry for data about where their students are, what their needs are going to be. And quite simply, it's difficult to address recovery if we don't have a sense of where students currently stand and where they'll be when they return to in-person learning.
That's great. Angela, what's your take on some of the limited time constraints we have with the pandemic, and how should we be using assessments this year?
Sure. Melody brought up a few good points. She mentioned evidence-based practices that we know we want to use when dealing with assisting students. You can't have future evidence-based practices without having evidence, and that's where the assessments that we're talking about are super important. We know that the the situations are not going to be the same as 2 years ago when we had normal, sequestered, standardized tests. We know that situation is just very, very different. But I think the most important thing to remember is that we need the data to ensure that students and schools get the resources that they need to take care of their students and the families and communities. And without having some data and using it appropriately, we can't do that. And so I guess the last point I would make on this is we've spent a lot of time and energy training SEAs, LEAs, or public school units and teachers on data literacy, like how to use data appropriately. And I trust that our practitioners, along with partners like SAS and others, can help us figure out what is the appropriate use of the data that we collect, given the constraints like remote learning, hybrid learning, and some of the other lack of subgroups having complete data. I think we can figure this out to make sure that we use the data appropriately, ethically, and respectfully to learn from, and to then figure out what are the resources we need for our students.
That's great. So one of the questions that we're seeing with some of the policymakers is just around the notion of shortening assessments. And so can you talk about what that means to you, maybe starting with you, Angela, and what are some of the implications?
So I'm definitely not a psychometrician. I want to put that on the record. And we've got testing experts probably that are on the panel or on the line today. But for my days living at a SEA, I do remember that shortening a test is not as simple as just removing selected items. There's a science to it. And so I think what's important with the shortening the test conversation is making sure that if it is shortened, that we're having those conversations at the state level. Each state is doing that now because it's a process. It's not something that can be done quickly. And we're talking about testing in a few months. That would need to be ongoing currently. So thinking through what questions and how to shorten it, how to test it to see if it's valid in the current short test form. But then I would also bring up with the shortening of the test, thinking about how do you prioritize the standards that you're assessing. So a positive for that is you may be able to prioritize a subset of standards that you want to specifically assess versus the entire standards or performing standards, or some states call them high-level performance standards. You may be able to really direct that test to a test of subset. So that's a positive, but I do think it's a timing issue, and that states would need to be already entering in those deliberations, discussions with testing experts. Melody, what are your thoughts on that? I'm kind of curious from your former seat at the state agency too.
Same thing, Angela. I was thinking about that, how I know we can't just pluck, say we're going to take 10 items away from this group and have a valid and reliable assessment. But if I put on my SAS hat, there are a couple of things that we are able to do that I think I wanted to just talk through. That first of all, we might be able to measure proficiency, and we could do that both individually and in the aggregate. But here's the caveat, if it's shortened too much, so that they're not measuring the performance on a wide array of the state learning standards, which is sort of what you referenced there, Angela, then looking more granularly at student strengths and deficiencies, that could be a challenge. One of the other concerns, and when we're talking about measuring growth, there is a concern in shortening the assessment. So basic requirement of the growth measures that the underlying scale on a test has to have that sufficient stretch so you can differentiate students of all achievement levels. And it must be able to differentiate students who are at a really high achievement level and a very low achievement level. So when tests are too short, or if they lack a variety of item difficulty, we sometimes see students that max out at the top scale score to bottoming out on the floor of the scale. And it makes it almost impossible to see how much growth was made for those particular students. So if there's not enough test items to sufficiently differentiate students across the achievement spectrum, then we lose that critical information and that's what we're looking for educators, for policymakers. And then it could also present challenges for how trends of growth and achievement could be interpreted. But there is one piece of good news with all of this. So if a state has computer adaptive tests, shortening them is not a worry for measuring growth with the results. And for non-computer adaptive tests, we generally say that 40 to 50 items works really well in order to ensure sufficient stretch across the scale. So if your state chooses to shorten tests, just keep that in mind.
So one of the issues that's at play also is just remote testing. Got a large number of students who have been in one of many different categories of education throughout this last year, whether it be traditional or hybrid or remote. So can you talk a little bit about remote testing and what are some of the implications for that?
You know, Angela, I'll jump in first because I also know that you're adding a really great perspective. You and I visited about this a little bit, but I can't imagine the decisions that state leaders are having to make right now in regards to this issue and many other issues as well. When we consider all those factors and the circumstances beyond just the interpretation of the data, we have to think about how we're going to deal with making that decision of administering tests and if we do remotely. So here's what SAS has found out just in some early results on some remote benchmark assessments. It showed that some students, and I'm clarifying that, in remote administration scored much higher or much lower than they expected based on their prior test performance. So it's something that we will be investigating when we get the actual summative data in hand to determine if there's outliers, maybe it's a testing anomaly. Then we'll work with our state and district partners to determine whether or not we should exclude those test scores or maybe report the results in a different way, which I think is going to be critically important. So when we capture this data and however we capture it, what will be interesting is that if we look at assessments, how they were given remotely, were they given in person, and then we can do that deeper dive into the effects of the testing mode. And I think that's what, Angela, you were talking about the other day in an early conversation.
Melanie, yes, you're right. So if you think about it, you want to make sure remote assessments, the test is testing the academic capabilities of a student, not the technology capabilities of a student. So we want to make sure that students are creating and completing an assessment in the way in which they receive the majority of their instruction. So that means if they were in a face-to-face classroom, that's, with a teacher and that dialogue, paper, pencil, maybe that's the mode that's most important. However, if they're in virtual learning, and they're used to doing assessments online, then that would be important. And so I think it's that situational aspect of assessment. We want to make sure it's testing the students' knowledge and skills, not whether they're struggling with doing the assessment online. So I think there's a practice component if we do go 100% remote assessments. So I have some concerns there around what are we actually assessing. I think another aspect with remote assessment is our SEAs. Melody, you mentioned, SEAs are struggling with all the decisions they're having to make. One of the reports that I just read this week was a McKinsey report around COVID learning loss, and it was talking about still we have districts and schools and homes that don't have access to internet, doesn't have access to technology. So how do we do that if students are taking assessments remotely at home, or sometimes even if they're on a virtual situation in schools? How do we ensure that the bandwidth, the infrastructure, all of that is productive for students? I think all of us have been in situations where we've tried to do work and the network fails or we get error messages. I can only imagine that would be a complete burden to students that are in a testing environment. So that's the second point. And then my last point on this, I would think, is we really don't have a lot of research or evidence. And at RTI International, the education research component that we do on rigorous evaluation of remote learning environments, I think this is an area that's ripe for some studies around, can students toggle between remote and paper pencil testing? What are the effects? Melody, you're right. Some of the data shows students are scoring a lot higher, some lower. Do we really know the effects of a transition to a remote assessment environment? So I think this is a field of research that's really ripe for studies and conversations at the SEA level, but also at the federal level.
Well, that's great. Thank you. I'd remind all of our attendees that if you have questions for either Melody or Angela, please go ahead and put them in the chat box, and we'll be monitoring that and happy to ask those as we go along. One of the questions that we've had a lot as we've talked with some policymakers, and I think especially even more at the local school district level, what happens if a large percentage of families opt out, or students just don't show up to take the assessments? What are the implications for that? I don't know, Angela or Melody, which of you wants to try to tackle that question first?
Well, I still think,
Go ahead.
yeah, you go, Melody. No, you go first. Jump in.
Thinking back, measuring, growth with missing student data, or missing student data has always been a reality. I mean, it's just been part of, I think, what we've dealt with. And prior to this time, there was other concerns that we had with missing student data because we were trying to meet the benchmark of the 95% participation rate. So it's always been there. It's always been a concern. But today, I think when we're looking at it from a statistical standpoint, it's a growing concern if a larger number of students opt out in this upcoming test administration. And we're hearing that sort of anecdotally, that in some larger districts, they're very concerned about the opt-out or missing students, if we want to call it that way. While growth majors can still be generated with a robust growth model, and it can accommodate missing data, there is concerns about the interpretation of that data when the opt-out numbers are significantly higher than normal. And it changes the baseline when you go forward. So for that reason, there should be caution if we're going to use growth in comparing what happened in 2021 growth results to what happened before and after the pandemic, if that pool of test takers is no longer comparable. But with that said, we can still measure growth and achievement for the students who do test. And I think that's what's really important, that we still have that information there and it's available. One other thing, though, to consider that we might not have talked about is that it's possible to still use the interim and benchmark assessments from this year, which we know a lot of districts have been doing across the country, to be able to determine growth if that summative assessment data is missing. And additionally, it's also possible to use prior student testing history. And we're able to use a predictive model with SAS to generate a projection for students' likely performance on this spring's assessment. So there's other ways that we can approach this, even with the missing data, that will help us to really understand the needs of students as they enter into this next school year. So bottom line, fewer test takers could influence the state's understanding of the pandemic's impact on student learning. But again, it's important that we take what information we have to be able to make some good information going forward.
Angela, any thoughts on that?
A couple of thoughts. I think the comparability factor is first and foremost on everyone's mind, making sure that the data we collect, if we compare it, that we're comparing it, ethically, responsibly, that aspect. And that's what Melody was indicating, the comparability aspect of the assessments. But we all agree, and even equity advocacy groups have gone on the record stating that collecting data around our subpopulations that we know have been impacted by COVID the most is what we need to be able to determine what resources, programs, and support structures some of our most trauma or populations that have been hit the most of trauma by COVID have the resources and the provisions that they need. So I think that's important to note that yes, we may have populations that decide not to take part in the assessments, but that still we need to collect that data. And then Melody mentioned some of the statistical analyses that you can do to make sure that you're not comparing things inappropriately there. I think it's also an opportunity for us to think about what are other measures in addition to the data we're collecting from standardized test scores, the multiple measure aspect. What about other pieces of data like OTL data or opportunity to learn, like testing attendance or looking at attendance, looking at some of your other SEL type modalities of assessment. So it's an opportunity for those populations that we may have incomplete data to marry the data we have with other types of data to get more of a complete picture of how students are performing. And I do like the idea of the multiple measure. It's a way for us to test some things now as for changes in the future around assessment systems and accountability systems.
So one of the questions that we've been hearing about when we've talked with some of the policymakers in states is just around what are the pros and cons of extending an administration window in terms of measuring student growth. And I think in this unique pandemic we're all living in, they're just trying to figure out what are options that they can consider and what are the implications if you go that route. Melody or Angela, I don't know which wants to go first, but I mean, what are some of those issues, especially around extending the administration window for measuring student growth?
Melody, I think you and I both were talking about this one, and we're both on the same page. So I could say my statement, Melody and I agree. I think the only concern about lengthening the window from a research perspective and just a scoring perspective is, would you be measuring the learning loss in the school year, or are you measuring the learning loss plus the summer loss? And is that a problem? And if it is, then we'd have to address that. If not, then just understanding that you may be conflating two issues in the typical school year loss plus the loss that occurs that we know is documented and referenced in literature around summer loss. What else, Melody? There was one other thing I think you had brought to bear on this one.
Yeah, so we know that, when you extend the testing window, it doesn't necessarily impact the ability to generate reliable growth measures, because expected growth is a relative measure. It's based on results from the revised test administration. But, when we talk about extending, it might be that we extend it throughout this spring. And I just remember when we'd have districts who were trying to determine when they were going to assess within that window, everybody wanted to be at the end of the assessment window because naturally your students have more time on task to be able to learn. And so there is that to be considered as well, that, there is a relative, it's relational, more learning time equates to, potentially performing better on the assessment. So those are other things that I think we've been wrestling with for a number of years, but in particular, when you're trying to compare groups relative to learning loss or growth, understanding that that's something to think about as well.
That's great. Thank you both. I've got one other question for Melody and Angela. I want to make sure if you have questions from the audience, please put them in the chat box. But it's been over 24 months since the last assessment of our nation's students. If there's some kind of a change where there are areas that don't have an assessment, it will be almost 36 months before you will actually have some of that data. So how can you use this pause, this disruption, to rethink how to assess student learning in the future? And I think this is really one of those transitions we're seeing from where states are responding to the pandemic. This is one of those on how do we rebuild post-pandemic. And so I'd love to get your insights on what can you rethink and how we assess student learning in the future.
Well, I'm going to jump in and take this chance to first acknowledge, educators and state leaders out there who stepped up, truly in this unimaginable set of circumstances. Who would have thought a year ago that we'd still be talking about this today? And they figured it out. They figured out how to make things work, and then there's the parents out there who have stepped up to support their child through the process as well. If they've been working, their child is at home. I wore a lot of hats over my career. I was in a classroom, department, chief. And sometimes I would think my work was really hard, but I have to say I'm completely humbled by the tenacity and the courage over this past year of the teachers, the educators, the leaders across our country. But with that said, simply returning to an approach where all students are learning at the same pace and the same place, I just don't think it's going to be an option. I think this was a time for us to step back. And specifically to assessment, I think there's this general belief, I still believe, that assessment has a place and a purpose in education. I think the question, however, is how can we use this pause in time to evaluate the best way that we're going to use that data that we get from assessment to ensure that what we're doing is what I believe the assessment was always intended to do. I think it was there to address inequalities in the education system and also to provide information to teachers and parents about student progress. And the ultimate desire, we all wanted to improve student outcome. And I think what was unfortunate over the past decade, when I look back, and it's probably been more than a decade, assessment has taken on this really negative connotation. There's two words that are always attached to it: accountability and high stakes. And so every time we think about summative assessment, that's what we think of. But this year, when we think about assessment, we need to think about is giving it that critical information concerning where students are in their learning progression. And we really want to understand, and I want to understand, and parents want to understand the full impact of the past year. Bottom line, we just need and we want to know. You know, if I went to a doctor today, I think about this and I'd say, I'm not feeling good, asked, I want to be fixed, I want this fixed. He's not going to do it until he assesses me completely. And then he gives me a plan that's based on my individual needs and based on my past history. It's not going to be the same for all of us. And that's the same way that I think assessment data can be used as we go forward. It needs to take a look at a previous performance and combine it with information at hand to determine the best plan going forward for students. So this is a real opportunity and a way for us to look at doing things differently, not only in day-to-day work, but as we're looking at assessment in general.
Great idea, Melody. Angela?
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, so I do think we want to know the full impact. And this is an opportunity for us to ask very strategic research questions, to answer some questions about teaching and learning in COVID times, but just about teaching and learning in general. And we can use this opportunity to really figure out what are practices that work with some of the populations and some of the students that we have struggled with providing services for over the last decade. So I do think it's an opportunity to think about the equity paradigm and making sure that our assessment systems after COVID really are doing what they were designed to do, which Melody mentioned is help with the inequities that we see in public education. And to that point, I think it's an opportunity for us to think about how do we look at assessments differently? Is it time to think about different types of assessments, authentic assessments, other ways to assess students outside of just standardized test scores? I think there's a place for that, but what are other types of assessments that we can use? Melody mentioned benchmarks. That could be something that that is used prior differently to, for learning prior to a summative assessment. We could also think about portfolio options, other competency-based models for assessment, which is something that we would definitely communicate about and think about moving forward with this individualized world. So research questions, I think, are important, trying to figure out the full impact, different modalities of learning, the impact there on populations. And then it's an opportunity for us to think differently about the assessments themselves, but how do we package them into an accountability model that is not punitive, that is actually helpful and provides diagnostic information for students.
No, that's great. And I think following on that, Angela, one of the questions that we had that came in through the chat was really around, how could these changes in assessments really impact teachers and what they're doing and what their focus is on curriculum and planning? Any ideas on some of that?
So I'll take a stab and then Melody can chime in. So at the teacher level, at the school level, curriculum and planning is important to make sure that you're following, the curriculum and standards that are determined not only by the district, but also by the state. So potentially if states change the way they do assessments, it may necessitate some changes at the local level, at the school level, but generally not unless the standards actually change. So I think anytime an SEA or a state is going through standards revision or standards changes, then obviously you would have potential changes in the assessment system and then potential changes in curriculum, but not always. It depends on how broad the standards are, and it depends on the level of change that we're talking about. So generally it's a year to two before changes at the curricular level at the classroom is visible. Melody, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm taking kind of a different thought about this too. If we're getting this data back, whatever the data shows us, we're getting this information back about how teachers are going to really need support in being able to differentiate their instruction. Because we know that when, if we have the information that comes back to us and students are at much different places and within their learning trajectories than what's expected, third grade may not be third grade. It might be a variety of grades within one. And so, that's where I think we need to provide some grace for them, support for them, so that they can look at different ways in which they can use what they have at hand to be able to differentiate and meet students exactly where they're at in that point in time. So I'm thinking about it along in those lines, how they're going to need support and help in this upcoming year.
That's great. Any closing thoughts or insights for some of the people out there on the education policy side from either of you before we close down this webinar?
I was thinking of one thing, this whole data quality is going to really be a challenge in this upcoming year. It's not, we're looking at not just simple gains or changes over time, and that's just not going to hold up. That states might need to enlist some real technical assistance in this work to make sure that the data that they're getting out of the systems is conveyed accurately to educators, students, to parents. And we want to make sure the public has accurate information and it's reliable as possible, so that it comes with a really good explanation and guides interpretation, that we make sure that we're doing exactly what you talked about, Angela, that we're using the data appropriately to inform, whether it's educators or the parents or the general public. So I think that's going to be really critical, is that we know that this is going to be a challenging year and being able to look at this appropriately.
Absolutely. Angela, any closing insights?
Yeah, sorry, Jeremy, a follow-up to that question, that first question around just closing thoughts, or the data literacy part, I think is very important for us to consider. And not only at the SEA level, but also at the school level, to make sure that teachers understand how to interpret the data that they will receive back. That's always a focus of data at the school level. I think at the state level, individuals like us here today, but also community members and education leaders in the district and state, having those conversations with their state agency now around what are you envisioning, what are you thinking, so that you can provide support and assistance to those at the state agency that may be thinking about changing and doing things a little bit differently, and just need thought partners to work with. So I think the data literacy component moving forward, and then taking this opportunity to really think differently around what type of assessments we use, and then how we use them, and then also lastly, I would say looking at our assessment systems differently moving forward.
Well, I want to thank you both, and I want to thank our audience from across the nation for joining us. These are not simple issues. These are difficult decisions that are going to be made at the state and local level. And I think there's a lot of opportunity if we talk to some of the national experts like Melody and Angela on what are they seeing and what are some of the opportunities for states to consider. This webinar on assessing student learning amidst standardized testing changes was actually recorded and will be available for future use in education of policymakers and teachers across the country. On behalf of all of us who've been able to learn so much in this past hour, thank you especially to Melody and to Angela, and I hope you all have a great afternoon.